Today's IT Summit acknowledges that we are a community with common interests. Our goals today are simple: to build our IT community and provide an opportunity for all of us to learn from each other. As you can see from the program, we have a great day ahead of us. 75 of our colleagues from every corner of the university will be sharing their experience on technology trends, innovations, best practices across academic, research, and administrative computing. And we're very, very fortunate today that our keynote speakers are President Drew Faust and John Palfrey, Vice Dean for Library and Information Resources and Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. We're also very fortunate to have several of our vendor partners here to exhibit their products and services. Please do visit the exhibits, and please thank them for all that they do for us, for their support today, and for the support they give us all year long. Before we get going in earnest, I want to take a moment for a few more thanks. Thank you to the Center for Digital Education for their help producing this summit. Thank you to many staff from across the university who contributed in ways large and small to making the summit happen. I have to give a special shout out to Vaughn Waters and to Mary Spidel, who just really demonstrated how flexible they were when I think in 2 days our registrations went from 400 to almost 1,000. And again, thank you to the vendor community and to our vendor partners for their tremendous support. The idea and the design for this IT Summit came from our CIO Council, all seated up here in the front. The CIO Council is made up of the CIOs from each of the schools, and our purpose is to lead and advance university-wide IT strategies in support of the individual school missions, but also in support of the university as a whole. Here's a short video clip to introduce the CIO Council to all of you.
A triumph of mathematical and mechanical skill is this great new automatic calculator at Harvard University.
When I started at the university, there was no such term as information technology.
I sat with a PC, the floppy drives going in and out.
Computing was based on key punch cards.
And I was not connected to any network.
We went from megabytes to gigabytes to terabytes. I'm at petabyte scale.
Information technology is no longer just an afterthought. It's essential for Harvard to be able to retain its preeminence in education and research.
And if you think about it, Harvard runs and implements almost every technology out there.
The Kennedy School of Government is made up of like 14 research centers. Executive Education, HKS, has 3,000 participants a year.
Everything from in-class classroom support to preparing course websites and working with faculty to digitize
engaging
materials.
Faculty and helping them utilize technology to get their message across in the classroom.
Model making. Literally cutting cardboard is now done by laser-controlled devices that can cut cardboard, plastic, acrylic, cork.
Video conferencing, a lot of data collection out in the field.
Robots
device
with a mechanical arm can drive a drill press or a laser.
Security, cybersecurity, privacy, no algorithm, what computing will be in the future.
But maybe a multimedia treatment of a case. We recently worked with a faculty member on the terrorist attack on the Taj.
10,000 hours of streaming video. We have hundreds of interactive simulations, all delivered via the web.
Harvard is an extraordinary place to work in IT at this moment in time.
So the challenge and the opportunity for us as practitioners over the next few years is to enable the next phase of the vision, to work with our sister schools to create more value, both for the university, but also back to our local school.
When you think of Harvard, you think of the greatest institution of higher education in the world, but then you look at some of the systems that we have in place to support it, and they are not equal in stature to the reputation of the university.
Harvard is a series of fiefdoms
Harvard has this 300+ year tradition of every tub on its own bottom.
As we say at Harvard, each tub on its own bottom.
Every tub on its own bottom.
For about the first month, I kept going. Now, let's see, what's the bathroom analogy with Harvard University?
I understand why it is the way it is, why we have 17 email systems, and why we have one of every possible kind of application software available. You can understand why we got there, but it's just so clear that we need to change the IT environment. So we have a relatively brief agenda, but I'm sure we'll fill it up. The CIO Council is Harvard's IT leadership team. Each member definitely comes wearing their school hat, but they're also wearing a university hat now. Stephen, do you have anything to share on identity and access management?
We need you to help us identify key stakeholders from a customer or business perspective.
As projects are identified, the people step up. That's an area of expertise for me. I'll lead that project. Ben Gaucherin has taken a lead role in our discussions around security.
If we don't all work together, essentially we're putting ourselves at risk. One of the big opportunities within security was to create a central group that could act as a security service provider to all of the schools.
Once the assessment is complete, you have the capability to log on.
You guys have your own, what's called an organization.
Under Ben's leadership, a work group identified 6 consistent security services that all of the schools need, and those will be in the new service catalog.
I now have a group of experts that I know I can rely on. I can shift my attention to more law school specific things. At the end of the day, better things for me to focus on and worry about.
By having collaboration and leveraging what we can from a university perspective, it allows schools like the Graduate School of Education to focus on technology in the classroom.
What makes today even more interesting than any other time is that we're going through a dramatic transformation. And for anyone who is interested in evolving their careers, environments where massive transformations are taking place are incredible places to be.
We'll be in a position to look at new technologies that we didn't have the bandwidth to look at before, things in social networking, things in cloud computing, in mobile computing.
We're coming together as an organization. We're going to be stronger. We're going to have more bench strength.
This is a historical level of change and collaboration at the university. People will look back on this someday and see this as a tipping point.
The IT community here at Harvard is remarkable. We have to make sure that we're providing the tools and the opportunities to deliver what Harvard deserves and needs. On behalf of the CIO Council, thank you. You're going to be hearing a lot more from the CIO Council, and you can follow what's going on the CIO Council on the CIO Council's iSite. We publish all of our agendas as well as all the products from our work groups, and you can find the CIO Council, of course, on the new HUIT website. Go to the community section, and please do participate and tell the CIO Council anything you want about what we're doing. One of the reasons this is a particularly exciting time to be in IT at Harvard is because the highest levels of leadership really get it. President Faust and her leadership team understand the transformative power of technology and how critical technology is for instruction and research at Harvard. They also understand that IT is going to continue to be increasingly important for Harvard's future. We are incredibly fortunate and grateful that President Faust has made time to be with us this morning. You already know that she's a historian and the 28th president of Harvard. I can also tell you that with her mastery and addiction to her iPad and her iPod, she is also one of us. Please welcome President Faust.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you. It's wonderful to see you all assembled here together and think about the capacity and opportunity you offer to our students and faculty. I really want to say how much I appreciate how hard you work on all of our behalf. And when Anne says, I get it, well, maybe I get it in the abstract, but you sure help me get it on a day-to-day basis when I'm confronted by all the challenges that IT can present. So Anne said that I'm a historian, so of course I have to begin by saying a few things about history. And some of the history that you saw represented visually in the video just a moment ago. I think many of you know that Howard Aiken invented the Harvard Mark I computer here on our campus and completed its construction in 1944. It was a part of a U.S. Navy war effort, and it was used for gunnery and other such calculations. It weighed 5 tons. I was thinking about whether everyone in this room put together weighs 5 tons. I'm not sure. And it had more than 750,000 parts, including 500 miles of wire. So this was obviously a major undertaking at a very early stage of the revolution that we still are in the midst of. You may also know, and I hadn't known this before, that the term bug, as in computer bug, as in glitch, was coined here. Did you know this, John? You knew this. I did not. This Mark IV used mechanical relays to open and close electrical circuits, and you could hear the clatter of these switches when the machine was operating. And one day there was a malfunction, and the operator in Harvard's computational laboratory found that there was a moth caught in one of these relays. And the moth was very carefully removed and taped to the logbook. And it's now in the Smithsonian Institution, moth, logbook, and all, as a part of the history of computing in the world. So among our many firsts, we can add bug to the achievements of Harvard. The first actual bug was indeed not virtual. He was real. But of course, it's not the past, but the present and the future that concerns us today, and really concerns all of higher education. How can we best capture the opportunities that this revolution in information and knowledge and communication offers us? And as I think about it, I think about how it intersects so integrally with many of the issues that are at the heart of my concerns as university president. Now, one of these concerns, and a concern for our wider community across the United States, is the cost of higher education. You read about this constantly, and it's a matter of great concern for families wanting to support students at college, for those of us who are running these institutions. And so one part of this equation of college cost, university cost, is trying to make education affordable through our undergraduate financial aid initiatives, through the kinds of enhancement of financial aid that have occurred in all of your schools in recent years. But another side of the equation is keeping our costs in check and figuring out efficiencies and ways of doing our work more efficiently and better. And IT offers us many opportunities in this area. How can we think about doing our IT work better? And how can we also think about using IT to do our overall jobs more efficiently? Now, a second issue that I and other university presidents think about a great deal is the nature of our increasingly global world and the role that education and knowledge play in those transformations. Harvard is a part of a global community in so many ways. 20% of our students come from places outside the United States. Our students and faculty are encouraged to play a major role in activities and research and learning throughout the world. And you know that in recent years, our undergraduate college in particular has enhanced the opportunities for study abroad and work and internships abroad for our students. So how do we think about these global imperatives in relationship to the work that you do? Clearly, technology is a major enabler of our global involvement. And an example of that has been in the press very recently is the transformation of Professor Michael Sandel into an international rock star. You know, he teaches his justice course in this very room, and we think that there are about 15,000 living alumni who've taken that course by sitting here and participating in the back and forth around questions of moral choice that are at the heart of this class. But the class was first turned into a online opportunity for our alumni and then into a PBS special, and it became the absolute rage in Asia, in China and Japan, so that over 1 million copies of Michael Sandel's books were sold. When he went recently to Japan, people were scalping tickets and lined up around the block in order to see the actual as opposed to the virtual Michael Sandel. He was named the most influential foreigner of the year by Chinese Newsweek. And so if we think about how the knowledge that was once contained in this classroom has had an impact on millions of people in Asia through the kinds of technologies that you enable, and how the ideas of justice, the ideas of education as questioning have had a major impact in both in China in particular, but in Japan as well. That too is something that I think we should feel really proud of, and it shows us some of the stakes involved in thinking about how to, and possibilities, stakes in a good sense, involved in thinking about how we can make our knowledge and our teaching available more broadly as part of a Harvard global presence. Another element of higher education that I think a lot about is how we have to become constant and continuous innovators in everything we do. This is an institution that is devoted to discovery, to being on the forefront of knowledge. And that has to be a part not simply of the fields we study, but also of the way we undertake our work. You all can offer us so much as we think about how to move into a culture of continuous improvement and continuous innovation. We are planning now for a university capital campaign, and at the heart of that capital campaign will be a priority of innovative teaching. And this will be something that we will need all of you to engage with us on as we make that a real signature initiative for the university and use technology in central ways as we explore how we impart knowledge in ways that are most appropriate for students of the 21st century. Now, you've probably heard me speak at one time or another about the notion of one university, about how Harvard's strengths must be built on the leveraging of our extraordinary schools across those tubs that everyone spoke about in the video. We have more distributed excellence than almost any institution on earth of our kind. But if we join those excellences together into combined strength, we are simply unsurpassed in what we can achieve. But I sometimes feel we stumble over our own feet in our effort to accomplish this. So how can we turn the stumbling into triumphant collaborations? I think that your work is at the heart of this because, of course, IT is a fundamental means of communication, of connection. But sometimes at Harvard, it has acted as an agent of separation, of systems that aren't compatible, or of registration systems that don't speak to one another. So I see as one of the charges that I would like all of you to think about, and one that I know is at the heart of Anne's approach to her job, is how we can use IT as the foremost vehicle of the kind of integration and collaboration that enables us all to learn most effectively from one another and to advance the university's extraordinary mission of discovery and of using knowledge in service of a better world. So I want to thank you for all you have done already in this regard, for the ways that you have embraced change and embraced the future. You can be leaders for all of us across Harvard as we think in each realm of the work we do about how we can do it better and how we can do it more effectively using the tools that you uniquely are able to provide us with the expertise and capacity to embrace. So thanks to all of you for spending the time here together today. Thanks to all of you for thinking of yourselves as a Harvard IT team, as well as a team that serves your individual schools. I'm really proud to be part of what you do and really grateful to be the beneficiary of all your work. Thanks so much and have a great day.
I am now honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor John Palfrey. Professor Palfrey is the Henry N.S. Professor of Law and Vice Dean for Library and Information Resources at Harvard Law School. He is an expert on internet law, intellectual property, and international law, and is the author and co-author of numerous publications and books. Several books I'm sure many of you have read: Born Digital, Understanding the First Generation of Digital Natives, and Access Denied, The Practice and Politics of Internet Filtering. Professor Palfrey is a faculty co-director of the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard, and his work on the effect of the internet and of internet usage on democratic process has been cited as influential to the dissidents in Iran responsible for the Green Revolution. Needless to say, there are many, many fascinating and interesting things we would love to hear John talk about, but I can tell you there is no one better to talk about IT at Harvard and IT in education at this particular moment in time at Harvard than John. John is a graduate of Harvard College, the University of Cambridge, and Harvard Law School. He is also a blogger, and of course you can follow him on Twitter. And please join me in giving a very warm welcome to John Palfrey.
Good morning, Harvard IT. This is so great that you're all together. What a treat. I learned from Kathy yesterday that you are calling yourself Hewitt, which is awesome. I think that is great. And Anne, this is a testament to your leadership and to Drew's leadership that you have convened this amazing group here together. And I think it would be great to give a round of applause to Anne for her leadership as she's come. Someone who has come from some of the most important jobs in this state and around the world, doing the amazing work at MIT on OpenCourseWare and then leading our Commonwealth in such extraordinary ways. I think we're unbelievably lucky that you have come here to lead and bring together this extraordinary community of IT professionals. And it's a real honor to be here as your keynote speaker in this first session. I have a really, really simple message that I want to convey in this talk, which is the centrality of what all of you do to the future and the present of this university. I think it's never been more true that there were 1,000 people who would come together as the core of a system, a human system that will drive us forward as engines of innovation in teaching and learning than it is today, and with you convened here today. And as a former student, but also a present teacher and administrator, there are so many ways in which what you do in the administrative zone, in the academic zone, in the research zone that are core to where we are headed and to where President Faust is leading us and so many faculty members that it would take hours, I think, to make this case in full. But I will make it in brief now. I wanted to start with the idea of Rip Van Winkle. If you were someone who, as a staff member or a student or a faculty member, were to have fallen asleep just outside here, call it 1980, and you were to have woken up in 2011 and found yourself in the Harvard of today, I think one of the things you would be struck by was not just a sense of wonder, which I think you would, about what is possible using information technologies. I think it would also be a true sense of fear, a sense of worry that you would not necessarily be able to keep up with what is expected of you. If you think about it as a staff person, an Excel spreadsheet or email as a way to connect. You think about it as a student, from the social, the Facebook and so forth, through to getting your lecture notes and sharing them. If you think about it most frighteningly as a faculty member, the idea that you can't teach exactly the same way that you did 30 years ago, nor do your research and in fact then get promoted at Harvard. I think you can see the centrality of what you do to each aspect of the core here at Harvard University. And I think of this mostly from the perspective of a faculty member. It's easiest for me to see at the moment. And I see it also from the perspective of someone who is trying to create a learning environment. This picture here, I suspect no one, unless they work at the Harvard Law School Library, knows what it is. It's an image from our great database of materials here at Harvard, and it's the study of Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. He was a student here at Harvard. He fought in the Civil War. He came back as a faculty member and then ended up being on the Supreme Court. And this is the room in which Holmes wrote many of those famous opinions, some of them great, some of them we now deride, but they were brilliant even when they were wrong. And to me, I think a lot about this learning environment. To me, this is very attractive, the idea that you would do your work sitting in a room that looked like this, surrounded by books and solo contemplation and so forth. You have all the greats around you assembled, and you could think about the hard problem before you and write something in multiple drafts and then throw them out in the fireplace and write some new drafts. But if you think about the learning environment for our students, it doesn't look a whole lot like that. It's different in a whole lot of ways. And I think one of the great challenges that we face today, and the challenge that we're all in together, is how do we envision the learning environment, whether it's a classroom or it's a lab or it's a library, that is the equivalent of this wonderful learning environment where we can write brilliant opinions, hopefully more right than wrong, in this new environment. And I feel like that is what you all and we all are constructing today, and increasingly will do through this Harvard campaign that Drew just described, which will have innovative teaching at its core. So the job, I think, that we all have together is to reimagine the teaching and learning environments that we are creating literally every day through IT and through human interaction that will rival and in fact surpass the one that Holmes had back in his day. To make the case for that and why it's so important, I want to start with the reason we are all here, which is our students, and the changing patterns of their own learning. I think this is something that we all know intuitively. How many people here have children or nieces or nephews or grandchildren in your life? Right, so most of us, I think, are familiar with the patterns that our kids have in terms of their learning, and they're quite distinct, I think, in that Rip Van Winkle way from what they were before. I work on a research project on youth and media, and one of the things that we look at is the ways in which kids are acting differently with respect to one another, with respect to information, and with respect to institutions like schools, like Harvard. And I think it's not the case that everything is different. Obviously, there are many aspects of learning that are similar to 30 years ago and then some. But in many respects, there is a very different quality to it. And I think the primary different quality is the connection, the notion of constantly being connected through a variety of devices. When we talk to kids about online life and offline life, they don't see the difference. They see it as just life. It's all converged. They're growing up in an environment that is a big mesh of the online and the offline. I think this is a very helpful conceit, and it's also a helpful conceit to see why your work and all of our work together in the information technology space is crucial. Think to the architecture of this very room, this very big classroom here. It is not sufficient for today's justice class, right? Professor Sandel still gives his lecture here, but so much of the learning and the connectivity happens in this broader global environment that President Faust mentioned a moment ago. And I think it's also true that these changing patterns of learning and experiencing information are not just our kids, they are ourselves. This pair of hands, does anybody know who those are? Obama, right? I love this, that you can put up a slide of someone's hands anywhere in the world, and people know that that's President Obama, the most famous pair of hands in the world. Of course, he has been unable to shake his crackberry habit, as most of us cannot shake it. Despite being President of the United States, he's still, I don't know those amazing security people he must have in the White House who let him carry this and make it work. But it's important to note that as we study this set of changing patterns and the extent to which we're all mediating our lives through technology, that it's not just kids. In fact, the similarities between kids and grown-ups with every year grows greater. So every year we see increasingly that it's our own practice that is what is influencing not only how we learn, but also how our kids learn, that we are modeling this all the time. I suspect there are a bunch of you who are emailing or tweeting right now under the levels. There's a gentleman in this third row there doing it. Absolutely, this is great. And we're all one here. So what are the attributes of the young people, these digital natives that we're now teaching? One of them is this multitasking concept, the concept that at any moment they're doing more than one thing at a time. They are doing their homework with Facebook up in the corner. They are instant messaging multiple kids. They're texting at the dinner table. I found myself with my wife recently. I was in the living room and she was in the kitchen, which are not very far apart in our little Cambridge home, and we were emailing back and forth. This was a bad thing because we were also talking to our kids and doing other things at the same time, listening to music. We are in a converged multitasking environment. And one thing that strikes me, if I were in a classroom over at the Harvard Law School, I'd be having a very different experience than I am right now. If I had 80 students in the class, they would all have a laptop in front of them, and they would all be looking down into it. Jim Waldo, professor and CTO here, has got it beside him. But were he a student, he would have it up in front of him like the gentleman does over there. And you would all be looking down into your laptops, not at me. So this is actually very awkward that you're looking at me. So pull out a laptop, and I'll be much more comfortable. Even during class, they are doing many things like email that are not great for learning, as it turns out. So even as there are wonderful things that we're doing, we also recognize that there are many things that young people are doing, including multitasking, that make them have much more challenge when it comes to the classroom. So one of the things that we all have to work on is not just the great opportunities that we have in terms of improving learning and spreading the work of Harvard, but also how do we mitigate the challenges of this digital age for our students to improve our teaching when some of their habits are bad habits, like multitasking. A second attribute of these young people is the presumption that the media that they are interacting with is digital in nature. I have a 6-year-old. She's a great, high-spirited little girl who's always up to some trouble in a nice, impish way. And we were on vacation recently, and we had forgotten our digital camera, so we had bought one of those disposable cameras. And Emmeline, that's her name, she was taking pictures of people's feet and backsides and things like kids do, those bad pictures. And she would flip it over, and she'd look at it and say, "Daddy, where are the pictures?" Because she would want to delete them, right, or to upload them to her parents and grandparents. And I realized that she'd never had that experience that so many of us have had, which is that you have a regular camera, you buy a roll of film, you put it in there, you take a bunch of pictures, you bring it to CVS, you give them $19, you wait 3 days, and then you get the images back. That's not her vision of media, right? It is a digital image in the first instance, and it's meant to be shared, it's meant to be edited, it's meant to be manipulated in various ways. And the same is true across almost all forms of media. Think about audio files. It's not all that much of a surprise that iTunes is the #1 music retailer in America. It's not all that much of a surprise that Tower Records has liquidated its stores. That would be one of those Rip Van Winkle moments if you were to walk through Harvard Square and not see Tower Records and quite so many bookshops and quite so many record stores, right? They presume that it's an MP3 file. They don't always pay for it, but they know how to get it, that's for sure. Movies, sort of the same way. Video, the number 2 search engine in the world being YouTube, owned by Google, go figure as to that, the number 1 search engine in the world. But ahead of Bing, ahead of Baidu, ahead of Ask is this video search session. I did a focus group 2 days ago in a local public school, and I was asking if you were doing a report on a topic you didn't know much about, where would you go for the information? When we did these focus groups 5 or 6 years ago, everybody said they went to Google first, and then they would often get to Wikipedia and so forth. But in this particular focus group, 3 people independently said, I start at youtube.com, and I search within YouTube for the information. The power of the video as the source of information, to me, is mind-blowing, right? The fact that we opened this session with a message to our far-flung alumni in that beautiful, beautifully produced message, or that the CIO Council is introduced, not just in flesh and blood right here, but in a video. It's an extraordinarily powerful medium for this generation increasingly. The only anomaly in this story, it turns out, is in the print zone. This will be no surprise to Cheryl LaGuardia and many of the librarians in the room. Turns out that the kids that we study don't buy the newspaper in the morning. They no longer wake up with a cup of coffee and read the New York Times cover to cover and then have, Walter Cronkite tell them what happened at the end of the day. No, they get their news in a very different way, through osmosis and grazing and through these mobile devices and so forth. They like their journal articles as PDFs delivered to them, and they can search on them and so forth. But when it comes to books, regular old books, that's the only anomaly in this story. Turns out that if you ask them whether they prefer a hard copy book that looks like this or an e-book, what do you think they tell us? Preference. Hard copy. Still, we just surveyed the Harvard Law School students, and 3 to 1 they preferred the hard copy of a book, a monograph, right? And we asked the same question of their case books. 3 to 1, they prefer still the hard copy version of the case book. And in fact, if you walk into the Harvard Law School library, it's not empty, it's full, elbow to elbow. It's full during the peak times. But they're not doing this. They're not pulling things off the shelf. They've got their computer in front of them and a cup of coffee. And then they have their casebook, this printed out $130 thing that they have with all of their cases in it, and it is just saturated with yellow highlighter ink and black lines under it. And you ask them, why do you still like that? Part of it is we haven't given them a good alternative, an electronic casebook, but mostly they love the annotation of that. They love to feel the text and bring it into class and to have done that yellow highlighting of all their materials. I mention this in part because I think we are at a moment of transformation toward the digital, but it's not exclusively digital. We're in a digital plus era. It is true that all of these books are still produced in the same way. They are produced as a Word document, initially a digital file, and then they are printed out, much like the Wall Street Journal is printed out every day, and also in a digital form. But one of the great challenges, I think, we have as a university and as libraries and as teachers is that it's not entirely a digital environment. This is a hybrid environment. And if you ask those kids, why do they prefer it for a book, not their course book, but a book that they're reading, they say the 3 Bs, the bed, the bath, and the beach. Those are the reasons they prefer the hard copy, which is very much like what adults would tell you at this moment. So we're at a moment of transformation. I think there's an uptick, a knee in the curve in terms of people using ebooks and so forth. Should be interested. I'm going to take a quick snap poll here. All of you in the room, 1,000 people, if you were offered the chance to read a novel, take just any novel, in a hard copy or an ebook, and you can't pick both. People always want to pick both, which might be true. How many of you would pick the hard copy? Okay, how many of you would pick the ebook? I would guess that that was about 80% hard copy to 20% ebook. And yet, of course, last year, 3 times as many ebooks were sold than the year before. And this year, Amazon announced that ebooks exceeded the sales of both hardcover and paperback combined. So I think we're at a moment where even an IT community is still preferring this hard copy, but it's changing very quickly. And I think that's emblematic of the challenge that we have. How do we take advantage of the physical world and the digital world as they change? And it comes with a bunch of problems that are core, I think, to the job of the university. One of those key problems is credibility of information. So we celebrate all the tweeting and blogging and so forth that we can do. We celebrate the multiplicity of sources, the fact that there are no longer monopolies on information, particularly in authoritarian regimes where people have been able to control the way in which information flows. On the other hand, that comes with huge challenges. It comes with huge challenges even for the elite students who come into Harvard College or the Harvard Law School or the Harvard Business School. One of the things we find that they are weakest at, and librarians know this also intuitively because they struggle with it all the time, is sorting credible from non-credible information on the web. So when they do these research projects, after they turn to their teacher or their friends to get information, they don't go to the reference librarian. That's number 14 on the list. They tend to go to Google and then YouTube and so forth and sort this information in Wikipedia, but they're not very good at figuring out which is a credible bit of information and which is not. And this seems to me one of those great challenges that we together can solve. Because the answer to me is a combination of things. It's a combination of the great reference librarians like Cheryl LaGuardia and Karen Storin-Linitz and others to help people figure out what the skills are that they need to have, but it's also using technology tools. It's also figuring out how does technology give students the cues to go into Wikipedia and see the discuss page and realize that in the discussions that are happening online, you can determine whether it's a credible or not credible bit of information. This is a huge challenge right at the core of our teaching enterprise and right at the core of what IT can do alongside ordinary sort of classic modes of teaching. And I think related to that, when you go and talk to parents and teachers about the digital age, is this problem of information overload, the fear that kids are getting so bombarded by information in this converged environment that their brain will explode, right? Or they're addicted to something like gaming. And my sense is this is not actually a physical malady, but it is something that we have to figure out how to help kids navigate this kind of a life. For me, for my own kids, it means kicking them outside to play soccer and so forth, time to time, banning them from using these technologies. But I also think it's itself a technology problem and one that we can help them to solve. How do we teach them the skills, not only not to go online sometimes, but to filter the information around them, not get overwhelmed, and then to succeed as learners and as researchers in this digital environment? There are plenty of challenges, I think, for us to take up. Okay, so those are the changing patterns of teaching and learning. I want to switch then to the changing patterns of teaching and research and to underscore what President Faust mentioned earlier. One of the key initiatives of the university in this campaign and of each of the schools is figuring out how do we put the word innovation and teaching and Harvard together? How do we make it that we are not resting on our laurels as an institution? Pause for a second and think about all of those industries that are information rich, that have gone through hard times recently. You can think about AT&T, the telephone monopoly, right? It's a very different company today in this world where they make their money as a successor entity on mobile phones, right? Completely different business, and they were disrupted totally. Think about the recording industry and its woes as an information-rich company trying to fight against the tide of piracy. Think about the newspaper industry today trading the analog dollars for digital pennies of ads, trying to figure out how do we have vital businesses. And then think about ourselves as a university. Are we anything other than an information business in a way? Yes, we have a different mission. Yes, we have a big endowment. Yes, we're protected in various ways. After all, we are Harvard, the H-bomb and all that. We have a great brand. But I think if we don't realize that we too could be disrupted as an industry if we don't innovate, if we don't think about the fact that we live in an environment in which the way in which we do our work has to change, then I think we are really putting ourselves at risk. And our alumni and our faculty and our leadership, and I think all of you intuitively get this, but we have to go and figure out how do we innovate in our core activities, and I think that much of what you do is a driver of that. I think part of it is thinking about the role of the student very differently. One of the things academics who study this topic love is the idea that students are no longer just consumers of information, but creators of information. The fact that in a Web 2.0 environment, much of the information is information created by young people for young people. But you can think about this also importantly in terms of the technology tools themselves. You think about Mark Zuckerberg, just a few years ago, a student in these very seats, creating Facebook as a not class project, something that has transformed the world in many ways. You think about Sean Fanning, the student at Northeastern across the way, creating Napster. You think about Chad Hurley creating YouTube. You think of the Yahoo and Google founders as graduate students. These hugely disruptive IT companies were all created while people were students at universities. And sometimes they were class projects, sometimes they weren't. But you think about the role of the creator, it's not just creating the content, it's actually creating the entire architecture, right? It is in fact creating the entire environment and iterating based on what their peers, our peers, are in fact doing. So if we think about teaching in quite a different way, of putting kids not just in the job of being the receiver of information from the sage on the stage in the classic sense of a lecture, and putting them in a position where they're solving problems and creating things, whether it's information on YouTube or code or a wiki or a blog or a written piece of any sort, I think we are thinking about our teaching in a very different, importantly helpful way. There are many examples of this innovative teaching, but I would suggest that we are only at the very, very beginning of this process, that there are many things that need to happen. And you go back to the Rip Van Winkle point about faculty, I would submit to you that most faculty members wouldn't want to admit how little we know about what we could do. So there are the Henry Leitners and others in the world who are doing wonderful things every day, but most of us, I think, need help to understand the art of the possible, that we know what our pedagogical goals are, but we need the guidance of this community. And it is the infrastructure that you provide, but it's also the guidance to figure out how do we apply technology in an innovative way to the teaching of what we do. And then there are others who I think are at the cutting edge and beyond. You saw the handsome face of Jeffrey Schnapp up there, who was talking about the digital humanities in the first video. This is a sign of what's great about Harvard, that Jeffrey and a whole bunch of his team, Jesse and others who may be here, in fact in the room, have created MetaLab at Harvard. We have the great good fortune that Jeffrey has come from Stanford. He was an Italian studies professor, but he's launched a digital humanities effort here within FAS at the design school, and partly through this project called MetaLab at the Berkman Center. I want to show you a short video of what he's doing and what his crew is doing through a project that blends, I think, all of these great activities of teaching and learning, and in fact, with our museums and libraries, through a project called Extramuros, which they have described. Let's see, right here.
Extramuros is a groundbreaking project that creates a multimedia library without walls through an open-source HTML5 platform built on public APIs. The project has 4 key components. 1. Geolocation. Extramuros enables the collaborative geoparsing of Harvard's digital media assets and offers new modes of geographic access and visualization. 2. Augmentation. Extramuros interconnects Harvard's digital collections with other high-quality repositories across the web, such as the Smithsonian, Internet Archive, Library of Congress, Flickr, YouTube, and others. 3. Curation. Extramuros will allow scholars and students to collaboratively curate and share online exhibitions, slideshows, and editions that combine text, digital images, audio, and video. 4. Multi-channeling. Extramuros makes curated collections and multimedia scholarship accessible on iPads, other mobile devices, and online. Extramuros is a unique collaboration between the MetaLab at Harvard, Francis Loeb Library, and independent designers and developers.
The idea that they've come up with is to combine all of these great rich resources that Harvard has and the web at large, but also to bring that into the learning experience that our students have. I think there's enormous, enormous promise in creating this digital humanities set of tools and infrastructure and teaching modes that Jeffrey Schnapp and his team have put together. But it's really important to note that that is at the margins of what we do today. The vast majority of the way in which we teach is the same way we did 30 years ago. And I think one of the key issues that we have, and a key issue for this community to discuss, is how do we scale? How do we scale small-scale experiments like Extramuros and things that are happening in little bits of Harvard University into something that has real scope to it and that in fact transforms the learning experience and the research experience here at Harvard? I think this is one of the things that Anne did brilliantly with the Open Courseware project at MIT. MIT is known for this amazing project, but there are probably hundreds of other projects at MIT that were going on that were quite wonderful. And I think at Harvard that we have at least as many, if not more, wonderful little things going on like this, but we don't get credit for it. We don't get credit for it. And part of why I'm so excited about Drew Faust coming together with people like Anne and all of you is to say, how do we, in fact, make Harvard known for this kind of thing? And part of it is PR and branding and doing good videos and so forth, but part of it is actually scaling this and figuring out how we bring this into many, many classrooms, not just at the margins. And I think another aspect of how we make this case is with respect to how we distribute our research. This is an area where Harvard is, if not one of the leaders, the single leader, which is open access. To me, this is Harvard's response to the Open Courseware project at MIT. As you may know, the Faculty of Arts and Sciences took an historic vote 3 years ago, followed by the law school and a bunch of our other schools. And the historic vote was to say, when we publish a journal article, we will make it not only available in the classic way in a printed journal, but we will make it available online for anyone to get. It's a complicated method by which the author holds the copyright and gives a non-exclusive license to Harvard and a non-exclusive license to a publisher. But the idea is that we can spread our scholarship to the world in a way that I think is much more consistent with our values and our mission. This is something where Harvard went first and where I think there are tons of opportunities, whether it is in the evaluation of those materials using natural language processing or AI or other things in a big digital humanities way like the sciences have done with genomics and otherwise, but also in how we connect the materials of our research directly with our teaching in ways that are open and different than Harvard's tradition of keeping it all here in 02138 and keeping it to ourselves. Okay, so if the first bit was changing patterns of learning among our kids, and the second was very early stage but super promising aspects of how we're changing our teaching and our research, I want to turn at the end here to the kinds of things that we can do together in thinking about innovative information technology. These are things that you are already all doing in many schools. I know best Ben Goshen and the Harvard Law School, where we are extraordinarily well served, and I know well that it's happening elsewhere. But I want to make a case for a variety of different experimental projects that we ought to do together as a community with IT professionals and teachers and students all working together. And the first one really is this idea of rethinking the spaces that we have. You saw the CIO Council discussion where I think Stephen Laster was sitting at the business school and Anne was talking to him across a teleconference device, which I imagine was telepresence, but I'm just guessing here given some of our allegiances. But to rethink the spaces that we have and the way that we connect. And I don't think that's only true, though, in terms of connecting people across the campus, reimagining the M2 bus, for instance, in a digital way that would join the Longwood campus and this campus. But it's also reconceiving the classroom and reconceiving all of these teaching spaces. I think right now, in this hybrid digital plus moment, it's a little bit imbalanced in a way. I think we still favor this physical space when we think about our architecture, and yet, in fact, most of the learning and most of the teaching could be or is going on in this digital space. And I think the net result for our students, in some cases for our faculty, is a bit of confusion. So, going back to my roots at the law school, I think often of this image. This is a side elevation by an architect of the building I work in. It's mostly a library in the middle, but it has classrooms on either end. And if you think about the way in which we got to that, or how we got to Sanders in this particular configuration, is that we had a series of pedagogical goals, right? And then we sat down with an architect and we said, what kind of a space do we need for a library and for books and then for things on either end which would function like classrooms? And then we built it, and they're beautiful. This is a beautiful room, and the rooms that we have in Widener and across the campus are extraordinary, but they aren't necessarily well suited right now to the kind of teaching and learning that we're doing. And why is that? Well, in part, I don't think we've done the theoretical work or the conceptual work to sit down with designers and in fact to say, okay, how do we get information architects, people who have the background that Ben has, together with the physical architects, the people at the design school right across the way here, and with those same pedagogical goals for the 21st century, and reimagine these spaces? How does the virtual connect to the physical? One thing I realized when I began being director of the Harvard Law School Library was that we had about 100 staff, and within that group, about 1/3 of one FTE was focused on our website. At the same time, when we looked at our traffic patterns, more than half of our traffic was coming not by foot traffic through the front door, but through our virtual front door, right? We were, in a sense, out of balance in terms of where our community had gone. And I think it's a reimagining of our own jobs and the way in which we create these spaces that is crucial at this moment where, over this Rip Van Winkle period, things have changed so dramatically. This is a job of imagining and reimagining learning spaces that we all need to do together. And in fact, the skill of information architecture, I think, is the missing ingredient, and that's the ingredient that's here in this room. I think also that we need to do it while listening to our students and listening to our graduate students and others as they change their practices. So I look again at my friend Cheryl LaGuardia because she does a ton of focus grouping. She is constantly asking students about how are they learning, how are you changing in your patterns. And the patterns of learning and teaching are not necessarily all changing in a good direction. The point is not that we need to follow our students exactly where they go, but we do need to understand it so we can lean into the good parts and then mitigate the bad parts. And I think that act of tracking and learning from these changing patterns is essential. Another thing that we need to do together, I think, is all to be out there looking among our friends and competitors and figuring out what other schools are doing. The act of benchmarking, which I know Anne is a big fan of. At the Harvard Law School, we ask a lot of the time, what would the Yale Law School do in a situation like this? We have very few true competitors, but the Yale Law School is one, and they are friends to us too. But whenever we have a problem, we look to our peers, and I think that's part of what we need to do. Harvard needs to be somewhat humble about the fact that we do not have all the answers, and particularly at this moment of transformation, when we're rethinking all things like our libraries and our IT and our classrooms, this is a great moment to be working with our vendors who are in the room and leaning into the great solutions that vendors have, leaning into what other schools that are our partners have. And yes, we will continue to compete on various things, but we cannot pretend that we have all the answers in all of these areas, and we need to learn from our friends and to work with them. And then I think we need to think about how we link up what we are doing here more effectively in the public domain that is the web, the public domain which is how people are learning. So go back to that open access pledge that we've taken as faculty. I think this is one of the things that we haven't yet leveraged sufficiently. We have lots of different repositories where we've put that information. So ours is Dash over there, right? And it turns out that Duke and other places have done the same thing. So we have these silos of information and excellence out there on the web. Sounds a little familiar, like the schools that we have here, or like the libraries that we have, 73 of them that we're trying to figure out how to put together, how to make, in fact, one. And if you think about the learning environment for our students, it is sometimes here in Sanders. I took Justice right here and listened to Professor Sandel. I totally loved it. But right now, the Justice student sitting there is getting a lot of information and maybe his articles and maybe his videos in this web environment. So I think just as we ask what our competitors are doing, we need to figure out how do we work with our competitors also to make this information available in various ways. And if you were to ask a graduate student today, how do they get information for a project they're talking about? Again, like the undergraduates, they rarely tell you they go straight to the library. They don't. They start with Google Scholar. They start with the Google product that links up all of these databases. And I think this is good on one level. I said we should work with our vendors and friends, and Google is a vendor and a friend of ours. But I also think we should think about what is the role of Harvard in the creation of other ways to get at that information. So just as we are putting our information out into the commons, how might we think about the role that we have for helping people find information in this increasingly converged and digital hybrid environment? I think there are many ways to do this, but I want to highlight one experiment that we have going on at Harvard, and which to me is an example of what we might do by way of scaling and working together to transform the learning environment for our students. This is a project in a little lab we have at the Harvard Law School Library called the Library Innovation Lab, and the idea is a project called StackView. There's a very simple premise here, but it goes back to a common complaint I think that people have about the digital era. The complaint that people have is that they love libraries in the traditional sense. We all have a positive sense if we are here in an academic institution. We have some memory as a child of walking into a public library and seeing a stack in front of you, right? And you see that book that you wanted that's right there, and then realizing, oh my gosh, that's a better book, like 2 books over, right? The notion of serendipity. And it's the same thing when you read the New York Times, right? You see that story that you didn't expect 2 down. You also probably liked the must in the library and so forth. There are other things that we like about it. But think about serendipity as something that the classic library had afforded. And in a digital age, you don't have so much of that. It doesn't present itself in that same way. It's usually a keyword search that gets you a pinpoint site within an article. You don't see so much of the whole of the elephant. So it got us to thinking about how might we in fact do better on that serendipity front, not worse, right? How might we in fact turn the bug, Harvard bug, into a feature for our learners? And there's another problem that we face. The other problem at Harvard is that with 73 libraries plus a depository 26 miles away, most of our books in law anyway are 26 miles away, there is no stack, right? We're so big that there is no stack. It is a perfect metaphor in some ways for Harvard overall. There is no way to get at all the greatness that is this university from a student's perspective or a researcher's perspective at one glance. But it turns out, if you think about it in virtual terms, of course we can. Of course we can have a stack, right? We just make a virtual stack. So the idea is, could you make a virtual stack of all the materials in Harvard's catalog for libraries? And think about it, you could do the same for museums. You could do the same for archives. You could do the same for any kind of learning object. So we built a virtual rendition of stacks. It's called Stack View. And there are lots of ways then you could think about ordering the materials. So librarians are very good at using call numbers and so forth that order them by subject. That's one way to do it. So you could have the virtual stack that puts them together the way librarians do. But you also might think, well, what are other ways someone might want to get at or sort information? So this particular image shows it based on circulation. So if you look at the top right, you see circulation heat map. The colors of the books that we've rendered here relate to how many times they've been checked out by different people. So you could imagine that you're a graduate student and you're interested in Pynchon and you are trying to figure out what should you read, where do you start? You might say, tell me where faculty members in the last few years have been doing their reading. What have they been reading? And it turns out Mason-Dixon gets a score of 108 in the faculty circulation zone. Who knows? Maybe that's a bad way to do it. Maybe you want to know what your other graduate students are reading. Maybe you want to sort it by discipline and so forth. All of that is possible, right? And if you think about it in those terms, all of a sudden, the bug that is the digital world that has less serendipity could have vastly more serendipity. In fact, we could be doing all manner of things that we didn't think before were possible. And that is only possible if those who understand the information architecture and the affordances of this space are working with the teachers and the librarians and the students to make that happen. And I think this is a great example of something that we could scale, these kinds of experiments that we could scale and which could be huge contributions through open source and otherwise to the world even beyond Harvard. And I think it brings you back in a way to seeing these challenges of the digital era for our kids and challenges for universities, in fact, as opportunities. I think it's a great thing to have challenges to solve. The credibility one is a really, really easy one in a way. This is a huge problem for our students, but it's also one where IT and teachers coming together, I think, can make huge contributions. I think the information overload one is exactly the same way. If you think about the idea of the web and this new information environment, we have the possibility of building the great digital library of Alexandria, right, that we've always wanted in some ways. Why are we complaining about information overload rather than thinking about the richness that we have available to us and for our students? Yes, it requires intermediation and sorting and tools and skills, but isn't that what a university has always done? Isn't that completely core to our mission? Isn't that why we are all here? That is exactly the opportunity, I think, that lies before us to reinvent the absolutely core mission and activities of a university. Okay, so we're getting near the time that you're going to go disperse to lots of other wonderful sessions. I wanted to end with another video. When we were working on a book called Born Digital, which was about all of these topics, one of the things that we heard often from, you do the book talk and people give you criticisms. One of the criticisms was, why did you write a book about this topic? You know kids don't read books quite so often. And the answer, of course, was, well, that's a good question. The other answer was, it was for teachers and parents and others who work in this environment. But it got us to thinking, We were thinking along the lines of Microsoft and dog fooding, you know, that idea that you have to eat your own dog food. If you're a technologist, you all do it all the time. So we thought, what is the dog fooding equivalent here in response to that? And the dog fooding equivalent, in a way, was to say, okay, so we think we're so smart, and we've written this book about how kids use technology. What if we, in fact, let kids tell the story? Right? How about if we put kids in that same position we were talking about becoming creators, about solving these problems themselves? And then we thought, so what would the version of a book be that kids would, in fact, want to experience? And it might be a peer-produced book where each of the chapters of the book was a 3 to 5 minute YouTube video, which is things that they actually do read. And what if they were ones created by their peers? So for the last few summers, we've brought students to the Berkman Center at Harvard, about a couple hundred yards that way, and we have thrown the book at them. And we've said, make a video about one of the chapters. And at the end of it, we now have a web page where you can go play chapter by chapter this book. So you don't have to buy the book or do anything like read it. You can actually just play a whole bunch of videos, and they're all made by kids. And I wanted to play for you, just as an example of this sense of spirit, this sense of creativity that these kids have, the final chapter of our book, which is on activism. And it's important to note that the kids that we selected for this, they're late high school students or early college students, they didn't have discernible technical skills before they made these videos. They worked in teams, and they were given a little bit of help and so forth and some equipment, but it's, I think, a really good example of what we all together, with the raw material of these just brilliant creative kids, can do to make an argument that is frankly much stronger than the argument that I could make in 30 pages in a chapter of a book. So I want to share with you this video. So what I wanted them to learn about was the way in which young people are using technology to change the world in regimes all over. This was well before the Arab Spring, right? Made this on the front page. And we wanted them to study movements, and we wanted them to study digital media and creativity and so forth. We wanted them to learn about the law. We wanted them to know what would it take, in fact, to make all of this stuff available on YouTube and to figure out a Creative Commons licensed bit of material that would make it lawful and not unlawful for them to do it. But what they showed us was what a book could be. They showed us as authors, what could it be once you write a book that's printed and put in a library, but in fact then remade in all of these ways by kids with their voices. And some of these videos have been watched tens of thousands of times, frankly more than the number of copies of books sold, right? So the effect of what they have done to recreate this learning environment, I think, is extraordinary and inspiring. And I think this is ultimately where our future lies. For us as teachers and as IT professionals and as researchers, this is in a way our job. It is at once to craft a more sensible way of learning information and knowledge in a digital era, but it's also in providing pathways where our kids, our students, will show us the way, to have the humility to realize that Mark Zuckerberg of the next generation is among our 6,400 undergraduates right now, and to listen and learn and to work with those students as partners. We do have to scaffold the environment. We do have to create the environment in which he or she, maybe the next time, will thrive, but also to realize that they will lead the way for us. And I think last, most important in some ways, is to realize that unlike previous generations, this is an environment that is a built environment all the time by us in an IT space. So the learning environments that we are creating right now are less about the brick and mortar being laid all around campus, but are being built in cyberspace in ways that connect to this. So ultimately, I think it's crucial that we figure out the partnership between the 1,000 people in this room and the thousands of people who are in the libraries and the people who are in the museums and who are in the teaching jobs to craft this new digital and physical learning environment of the university for the 21st century. And I realized how unbelievably humbling it was to be able to open this first summit and to talk to you all about it. And mostly I want to say how exciting it is to be in a posture of a partner with all of you in creating this new learning and research environment, and how grateful I am to the fact that so many talented people have chosen Harvard as a place to devote your professional lives in working with us on this task. So most important of all, in addition to the centrality of what you do to teaching and learning, thank you, thank you, thank you for the partnership that we're in to remake the university of the 21st century right here at Harvard. So thank you so much.